Shadows have stories to tell, but not everyone dares to listen. They whisper in the dead of night, waiting for someone brave enough to hear them. In the heart of a small, forgotten town, shrouded by dense woods and veiled in an air of melancholy, stood an abandoned house. The locals called it the Whispering House, a name that sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest souls. For decades, the house had remained untouched, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, and its once white paint now a dull, peeling gray. But it wasn't the decaying structure that frightened the townsfolk. It was the whispers. Every night, faint, unintelligible murmurs could be heard emanating from within the house. Some claimed the whispers were mournful, as if the walls themselves were grieving. Others said they were angry, filled with a rage that chilled the blood. The whispers were not constant. They came and went, ebbing and flowing like the tide, but they were always there, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within. The house had been empty since the 1950s, when the Johnson family, beloved members of the community, vanished without a trace. The Johnsons had been a cheerful, hard-working family. Thomas, the father, a carpenter, Margaret, the mother, a schoolteacher, and their 2 children, Sarah and Michael. They were well liked, but rumors had swirled about strange occurrences in their home. The family claimed to hear voices in the walls, whispers that no one else could hear. They spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of doors slamming shut without explanation, and of a cold presence that seemed to follow them from room to room. One night, the entire family disappeared. The house was found empty, the table set for dinner, the food untouched. The only clue was a single word scrawled on the living room wall in what appeared to be charcoal: leave. The townsfolk were baffled. Search parties scoured the woods, but no trace of the Johnsons was ever found. The house was sealed shut, and over time it became a place of fear and superstition. As the years passed, the legend of the Whispering House grew. Some claimed the house was cursed, built on land that had once been a burial ground for a forgotten tribe. Others believed the Johnsons had angered a malevolent spirit, and their disappearance was its revenge. Whatever the truth, the house became a magnet for thrill seekers and paranormal investigators, though none dared to stay long. One investigator, a man named Harold Grayson, spent a single night in the house in the 1970s. He emerged the next morning, pale and trembling, muttering about voices in the walls and eyes watching from the shadows. He refused to speak of what he had seen and left town the same day, never to return. In the 1990s, a group of teenagers broke into the house on a dare. They lasted less than an hour before fleeing in terror, one of them swearing he had seen the ghost of a young girl standing in the hallway, her eyes hollow and her mouth twisted in a silent scream. Despite the stories, no one had ever spent an entire night inside the Whispering House. Until Emma. Emma Carter was a thrill seeker, a young woman with an insatiable appetite for adventure. She had explored abandoned asylums, haunted cemeteries, and crumbling mansions, always searching for that next adrenaline rush. When she heard the stories about the Whispering House, she knew she had to see it for herself. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a sense of bravado, Emma arrived at the house just as the sun was setting. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, and the house loomed before her like a specter. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding, but then she pushed open the creaking back door and stepped inside. The interior was a time capsule of the 1950s. The furniture was draped in yellowed sheets, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper adorned with faded floral patterns. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the beam of her flashlight. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she made her way to the living room, where she set up her camera on a tripod. As the hours passed, the house remained eerily silent. Emma began to wonder if the stories were just that. stories. But then, as the clock struck midnight, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But soon, they grew louder, forming words. "Get out, before it's too late." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was just her imagination, but then she felt it, a cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the halls. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Panic set in as she realized the door was gone, replaced by solid wall. The windows were sealed shut, the glass unbreakable. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of voices pleading, begging, warning. Emma stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering. Shadows moved on their own, twisting and writhing like living things. And then she saw it, a figure emerging from the wall, its form shifting and indistinct. It was a man, his eyes hollow, his mouth twisted into a sinister grin. Emma screamed, but no sound came out. The figure reached for her, its fingers elongating into shadowy tendrils. The last thing she saw was the camera's flash as it captured her terrified face, the shadowy hands closing in around her. The next morning, Emma's camera was found on the porch, its lens cracked and its memory card corrupted. The last photo, the only one that could be recovered, showed Emma's face frozen in terror, her eyes wide with fear, as shadowy hands reached out from the walls. Emma herself was never seen again. To this day, the Whispering House stands as a grim reminder of the town's dark past. Passers-by claim to hear faint whispers coming from within, and sometimes a voice pleading for help. Some say it's Emma, trapped in the house, her spirit bound to the walls. Others believe it's the Johnsons, still trying to warn anyone who dares to enter. The house remains abandoned, its secrets buried within its walls. But one thing is certain: the whispers are real, and they are waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to listen. The town of Black Hollow was no stranger to strange tales, but none were as chilling as the legend of the midnight train. Every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., a train would arrive at the abandoned station on the edge of town. No one knew where it came from or where it was going. The station had been closed for decades, its tracks overgrown with weeds and its platform crumbling with age. Yet the train came without fail, its arrival announced by a distant, mournful whistle that sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. The train was said to be a gateway to another realm, a place where the lost and the damned were taken. Those who boarded it were never seen again. Over the years, the legend had become a cautionary tale, a story told to keep curious souls away from the station after dark. But for Tom, a man fascinated by urban legends, the mystery was too compelling to ignore. He had spent years researching the train, and one night he decided to see it for himself. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, Tom waited at the station. Right on time, the train arrived, its doors creaking open as if inviting him inside. Against his better judgment, Tom stepped aboard. The moment he did, the doors slammed shut, and the train sped into darkness. The passengers were silent, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes fixed on some distant point. Tom tried to speak to them, but they ignored him, as if he weren't there. When the train finally stopped, Tom found himself in a desolate, otherworldly landscape. The sky was a sickly green, and the ground was littered with twisted, skeletal trees. He tried to run, but the passengers grabbed him, pulling him back onto the train. The next morning, his wallet was found on the tracks, but Tom was never seen again. Tom's disappearance left a void in the life of his childhood friend, Clara. She had always been skeptical of the town's superstitions, but Tom's fate shook her to her core. Determined to uncover the truth, Clara threw herself into researching the midnight train. She spent months piecing together fragments of information, uncovering stories that had been buried for generations. She learned that the train had first appeared over a century ago during a time of great tragedy in Black Hollow. A devastating fire had swept through the town, claiming dozens of lives, and the train had arrived shortly after, its origins unknown. Over the years, it had become a harbinger of doom, appearing only in times of great loss or upheaval. Those who boarded it were never seen again, their fates shrouded in mystery. Clara also discovered something else, a name whispered in the oldest records: the conductor. According to the tales, the conductor was the one who controlled the train, a spectral figure who guided it through the void between worlds. Some believed the conductor was a vengeful spirit, punishing those who dared to defy the natural order. Others thought it was a guardian, offering passage to those who had no other way to move on. Clara wasn't sure what to believe, but she knew one thing. If she wanted to find Tom, she would have to face the conductor. On the night she decided to board the train, Clara prepared herself in ways Tom never had. She carried a silver locket, a gift from her grandmother that was said to ward off evil spirits. She wore a coat lined with herbs believed to protect against curses, and in her pocket she carried a small, leather-bound journal filled with every piece of information she had gathered about the train. The train arrived as it always did, its mournful whistle cutting through the silence of the night. Clara stepped aboard, her heart pounding in her chest. The interior was just as Tom had described, cold, lifeless, and filled with the hollow-eyed passengers. But Clara noticed something he hadn't mentioned. The mirrors lining the walls didn't just reflect the passengers, they seemed to show glimpses of their past lives. In one, she saw a man holding a child's hand, their faces filled with joy. In another, a woman stood at the edge of a cliff, her eyes filled with tears. Clara realized that these weren't just passengers, they were souls, trapped in a purgatory of their own making. As the train sped through the darkness, Clara made her way to the front of the car. She had to find the conductor. The journey felt endless, the train moving through a void where time and space had no meaning. Finally, she reached the door to the engine car. It was locked, but as she touched the handle, it clicked open on its own. Inside, the conductor stood with his back to her, a tall, shadowy figure clad in a tattered uniform. His presence was overwhelming, a force of nature that made the air around him crackle with energy. Clara hesitated, but then she spoke. "I've come for Tom," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I know he's here. Please let him go." The conductor turned slowly, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. His face was both human and not, his features shifting like smoke. His eyes burned with a cold blue light, and when he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through her very soul. "The train does not release its passengers," he said. "They board of their own will, and they remain until their journey is complete." But Tom didn't know what he was getting into, Clara argued. He didn't understand. Please, there has to be a way. The conductor studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out an ancient pocket watch. He held it out to her, the face cracked and the hands frozen in place. "Time is the key," he said. "If you can restart the watch, the train will stop, and you may take him. But be warned, once the watch starts, it cannot be stopped. You will be bound to the train just as he is." Clara took the watch, her hand shaking. She didn't know how to restart it, but she had to try. As she fumbled with the mechanism, the train began to slow. The passengers stirred, their hollow eyes turning toward her. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Finally, with a soft click, the watch began to tick. The train came to a halt, and the doors opened. Clara rushed to find Tom, her heart pounding. He was there, sitting among the passengers, his face pale and lifeless. She grabbed his hand, pulling him to his feet. "Tom, we have to go," she shouted. He looked at her, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "I'm here to save you," she said, dragging him toward the door. But as they stepped onto the platform, the conductor appeared before them, his form towering and menacing. "You have restarted the watch," he said. "The train cannot leave without you." Clara's heart sank. She had known the risk, but she hadn't fully understood what it meant. She looked at Tom, then back at the conductor. "Take me instead," she said. "Let him go. He doesn't belong here." The conductor considered her offer, his glowing eyes narrowing. Then he nodded. "Very well. But remember, once you board, there is no return." Tom protested, but Clara pushed him toward the open doors. "Go," she said. "Live your life. Don't let this train take anyone else." As the doors closed and the train began to move, Clara watched Tom disappear into the distance. She felt a strange sense of peace, knowing she had saved him, even if it meant sacrificing herself. The passengers around her were silent once more, their hollow eyes fixed on some distant point. Clara sat among them, the ticking of the watch echoing in her ears. The midnight train continued its journey, carrying its new passenger into the void. And though Clara was never seen again, her sacrifice became a part of the legend, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there is always a glimmer of hope. The train still comes every night at 3:33 a.m., its mournful whistle a haunting melody that echoes through the town. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you might hear the faint ticking of a watch, a reminder of the girl who dared to defy the conductor and save a soul from eternal damnation. Lily had always been drawn to the mysteries of her grandmother's old house. It was a sprawling, creaky Victorian home nestled at the edge of a dense forest, its walls whispering secrets of the past. When her grandmother passed away, leaving the house to her, Lily saw it as an opportunity to start fresh, away from the chaos of the city. She had no idea that the house held more than just memories. It held a presence, one that had been waiting for her. The porcelain doll was the first sign that something was wrong. Its discovery in the attic had been accidental, buried under a pile of dusty quilts and forgotten trinkets. The moment Lily picked it up, a chill ran down her spine. The doll's glassy blue eyes seemed to glint with a strange intelligence, and its cracked porcelain face bore a smile that was both sweet and sinister. Despite her unease, Lily couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It felt significant, as if it belonged to the house in a way she couldn't quite understand. The strange occurrences began subtly. At first, it was just the footsteps, soft, rhythmic thuds above her head as she tried to sleep. She told herself it was the house settling, the wind rattling the old beams. But then the doll started moving. She would leave it on the attic stairs, only to find it perched on the windowsill in her bedroom the next morning. Its head would tilt slightly, as if observing her, and its cracked smile seemed to widen every time she looked at it. One night, the laughter began. It was faint at first, a childlike giggle that echoed through the halls. Lily followed the sound, her heart pounding, until she reached the attic. There, in the center of the room, sat the doll. Its head was turned toward her, its glassy eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the attic window. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed the doll, shoved it into an old wooden box, and locked it away, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The next morning, the box was empty. The doll was back in its original spot, its dress slightly more tattered, its smile slightly more pronounced. Lily's fear turned to desperation. She tried everything, burying it in the garden, throwing it into the river, even burning it in the fireplace. Each time, the doll returned, always closer, always more menacing. It was as if it were feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every failed attempt to destroy it. One evening, as Lily sat in the living room, she noticed something strange about the house itself. The walls seemed to hum faintly, and the air grew heavy, as if the house were alive. She found herself drawn to the attic again, where she discovered an old journal hidden beneath the floorboards. It belonged to her grandmother, and its pages were filled with frantic scribbles about the doll. Her grandmother had called it Eleanor, a name that sent a shiver down Lily's spine. The journal spoke of rituals, of binding the doll to the house, of a curse that could never be broken. The final entry was a warning. Do not let her out. She will take you, as she took me. Lily's hands trembled as she read the words. She realized now that the doll was no ordinary toy. It was a vessel, a conduit for something far darker. Her grandmother had tried to contain it, but the curse had never been fully broken, and now it had chosen Lily as its next victim. That night, Lily woke to the sound of her name being whispered. She opened her eyes to find the doll sitting on her chest, its cold porcelain hands gripping her shoulders. Its mouth moved, forming words that sent ice through her veins. "You're mine now." She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The doll's eyes glowed faintly, and the room seemed to spin as Lily felt herself being pulled into a darkness she couldn't escape. When the sun rose, the house was silent. The doll sat on Lily's bed, its smile wider than ever, its eyes gleaming with a newfound light. Downstairs, the front door creaked open, as if inviting someone new to enter. And in the attic, the journal lay open to a fresh page, its words scrawled in a handwriting that wasn't Lily's. "She's mine now. Who's next?" Months passed, and the house remained shrouded in silence, its windows dark and its halls empty. The doll sat motionless on Lily's bed, its porcelain face frozen in that unnerving smile. But the stillness was deceptive. The house was alive, its walls humming with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, as if it were waiting, biding its time. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a car pulled up to the gate. A young man named Ethan stepped out, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets as he surveyed the property. He was a freelance photographer, drawn to the house by its eerie beauty and the rumors that surrounded it. He had heard stories about the old Victorian home at the edge of the forest, stories of disappearances, of strange laughter echoing through the halls, of a curse that no one could explain. To Ethan, it was the perfect subject for his next project. He pushed open the creaky gate and made his way up the overgrown path to the front door. The key he had obtained from the real estate agent turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open with a groan. The air inside was heavy, carrying the scent of dust and decay. Ethan stepped inside, his camera slung over his shoulder, and began to explore. The house was a photographer's dream. Sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, and the furniture was a mix of antique pieces covered in dusty sheets. Ethan's camera clicked as he captured every detail, from the intricate carvings on the banister to the cobwebs that draped the chandelier in the dining room. But as he ventured further into the house, he began to feel a strange unease. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the feeling persisted. When he reached the attic, the unease turned to dread. The doll was there, sitting on a wooden chest in the corner. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow him as he approached, and its cracked smile sent a shiver down his spine. Ethan hesitated, then lifted his camera and took a photo. The flash illuminated the attic, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw the doll's head tilt slightly, its smile widening. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light, and continued his exploration. That night, Ethan decided to stay in the house. He set up a makeshift bed in the living room, using a sleeping bag and a few blankets he had brought with him. As he lay there, the house seemed to come alive around him. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and the wind outside howled like a mournful wail. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just an old house doing what old houses do. But then he heard the laughter. It was faint at first, a childlike giggle that seemed to come from the attic. Ethan sat up, his heart pounding. He grabbed his flashlight and made his way up the stairs, the laughter growing louder with each step. When he reached the attic, he found the doll sitting in the center of the floor, its head tilted as if watching him. "This is insane," he muttered, trying to convince himself that he was imagining things. He picked up the doll and shoved it into a nearby trunk, slamming the lid shut. "Stay there," he said, as if the doll could hear him. But when he returned to the living room, the laughter followed him. It echoed through the halls, growing louder and more menacing. Ethan tried to ignore it, burying his head under the blankets, but the sound was relentless. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his keys and bolted out the door, leaving everything behind. Ethan didn't return to the house for weeks, but the experience haunted him. He couldn't shake the image of the doll's smile or the sound of its laughter. He began to research the house, digging through old records and newspaper archives. What he found chilled him to the bone. The house had a long history of tragedy. Over the years, several people had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, their bodies never found. The most recent case was Lily, the granddaughter of the previous owner, who had vanished without a trace. Ethan also discovered references to a curse, a dark ritual that had been performed in the house decades ago. The details were vague, but one name kept appearing: Eleanor. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan decided to return to the house. This time, he brought a voice recorder, a thermal camera, and a sense of grim determination. He wasn't just a photographer anymore. He was an investigator, and he was going to get to the bottom of this. When he arrived, the house was just as he had left it. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward him as he stepped inside. He set up his equipment in the living room and began his investigation, starting with the attic. The doll was there, sitting on the chest where he had left it. Its smile seemed even wider now, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. Ethan ignored it, focusing on his equipment. He turned on the voice recorder and began to ask questions. "Is anyone here?" he asked, his voice echoing through the attic. At first, there was only silence, then, faintly, he heard a whisper. It was so soft he almost missed it, but it was there. A single word, spoken in a child's voice. "Mine." Ethan's blood ran cold. He grabbed the thermal camera and scanned the room. The screen showed a cold spot near the doll, its temperature far lower than the surrounding area. He took a step closer, and the doll's head turned to face him. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the camera. The doll's mouth moved, forming words that sent a chill through his veins. "You're next." Ethan knew he had to act fast. He spent the next few days researching the curse, piecing together fragments of information from old books and online forums. He learned that the doll was a vessel for a malevolent spirit, bound to the house by a dark ritual. The only way to break the curse was to perform a counter-ritual, one that would sever the spirit's connection to the doll and banish it from the house. The ritual required specific items: a silver dagger, a vial of salt, a black candle, and a lock of hair from someone who had been claimed by the curse. Ethan had everything except the hair. He knew there was only one place to find it. That night, he returned to the attic. The doll was waiting for him, its smile wider than ever. He approached it cautiously, the silver dagger in one hand and the vial of salt in the other. As he reached for the doll, its head snapped toward him, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You can't stop me," it whispered, its voice a chilling blend of a child's innocence and something far darker. Ethan didn't respond. He grabbed the doll and began the ritual, chanting the words he had memorized from the ancient text. The The doll thrashed in his hands, its porcelain face contorting in rage. The air around him grew colder, and the walls of the attic seemed to close in. But Ethan didn't stop. He poured the salt around the doll, lit the black candle, and held the lock of hair, Lily's hair, which he had found in her grandmother's journal, over the flame. As the hair burned, the doll let out a piercing scream, its body cracking and splintering until it shattered into pieces. The house fell silent. The air grew warm, and the shadows receded. Ethan collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. He had done it. The curse was broken. Ethan left the house the next morning, never looking back. He published his findings, exposing the truth about the house and the curse. The story made headlines, and the house was eventually demolished, its secrets buried beneath the rubble. But as the years passed, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. He would hear faint laughter in the dead of night, or catch a glimpse of a porcelain face in the corner of his eye. He told himself it was just his imagination, a lingering effect of the trauma he had endured. Then one night, he woke to find a single shard of porcelain on his bedside table. It was small, no larger than a fingernail, but it was enough to send a chill through his veins. He picked it up, his hands trembling, and saw the faintest trace of a smile etched into its surface. The curse was never truly broken. It had only found a new vessel, and Ethan knew deep down that he would never be free. You have listened, but the echoes never stop. They follow you in the silence, in the dark, in the places you fear to look. Like, subscribe, and stay in the shadows.